Let's talk for a few minutes about the debate resolution we're going to be talking about this year. The resolution we're going to be discussing until the end of the semester is resolved. The abuse of illegal drugs ought to be treated as a matter of public health, not of criminal justice. This resolution is going to require us to evaluate various methods of dealing with illegal drug abuse in the United States. So this isn't going to talk about drugs that are legal to use, but it's only the illegal abuse of drugs in the United States. One thing important to remember is that we're talking about values, not policy, when we talk about this resolution. This resolution is not concerned with what the best policy is, but it's concerned with whether or not we can uphold a certain value by moving in one direction or the other based on a specific type of policy. So we might be interested in the policy implications, but they're not the focus of the debate round. Thus, effectiveness, net benefits, costs, those aren't going to be of great importance as we debate this resolution. Instead, we're going to look at values, autonomy, liberty, societal well-being, safety, human life, those kinds of things, and compare which method of dealing with drug abuse, with illegal drug abuse, better reaches this threshold. Let's go over a little bit of history of drug regulation in the United States. Drugs have been used by people around the globe for pretty much all of human history. Alcohol, various natural remedies, lots of different herbs mixed into drinks that people would use to try to cure what ailed them. However, these drugs have also been used for illicit purposes and things that we may not consider good. In addition, in colonial and frontier times, in the United States we had various elixirs, which were basically attempts to cure what ails you by mixing lots of different things together, and often these were people called snake oil salesmen, people going out and selling their latest remedy. In the United States in 1900, more people were addicted to drugs than there are addicted to drugs today. That's important to remember. There were more people addicted to drugs in 1900 than there are today. It was about 2 to 5% of the United States population addicted to drugs back then. Most of the addiction was morphine addiction. A lot of former Union soldiers, because in the Union Army, whenever a person got injured, they would use morphine to try to help them. There was morphine addiction. So about 2 to 5% of the United States was addicted, and mostly they were addicted to morphine. Rural, white, middle-class women were the biggest group of addicts in 1900. It's important to remember that in 1900 most addiction was accidental. It wasn't the result of somebody intentionally taking a drug which they then became addicted to. It was someone taking an elixir or one of these remedies that just happened to be mixed with a lot of morphine, or a soldier who was injured who was given morphine to try to cure him or help him throughout his injury. As a result, these people got an addiction to something only because they were given this chemical by someone else. In 1906, the United States passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. This was a health law. It especially restricted what could be sold. It wasn't a law that was based on restricting what individuals could and couldn't do. It was more about what could and couldn't be sold in the United States. It said that drugs had to be approved, some things were limited to being sold only as prescriptions, and addictive drugs had to be labeled as such. So if you were going to sell a drug that was addictive, you had to tell people that it was potentially addictive. This law is still on the books, and that's part of why we have a lot of FDA regulations that restrict what sort of pharmaceuticals individuals can buy and use. Professor Charles Whitebread said that this is the single law which has done the most in this country to reduce the level of drug addiction. That's a really important point. Professor Charles Whitebread, who was formerly at University of Virginia Law School and is now at USC Law School, he points out how important this law was in reducing addiction in the United States. That might be something worth researching. In 1914, the Harrison Act passed. This was the first criminal drug law. So 1914 is the first time at which the debate we are going to be having actually had to take place. It applied to opium, morphine, cocaine, and their families, other drugs that could be made from those kinds of products. So that's the first time these types of laws went into place. After 1914, many states began to regulate different types of drugs, specifically marijuana. In 1937, there was the first national marijuana prohibition. It passed Congress without a recorded vote, and there was almost no debate whatsoever. In 1951, the Boggs Act was passed to stop marijuana because it was considered a gateway drug, or the first step toward heroin addiction. So in 1951, the United States Congress passed a law to ban the use of marijuana explicitly because they were worried that it was going to be a drug that other individuals would take and then become addicted to heavier or more dangerous drugs like heroin. The future laws basically just increase the penalties. So we really haven't changed what is or is not illegal since 1951, but mostly we've just changed what happens if you get caught with it. Normally this was prompted because in the media or somewhere else people thought that addiction and drug use was increasing. Drugs became the most penalized item in our society. So much so that in Virginia you would get 15 years for capital murder, first-degree murder, 15 years minimum sentence in jail. But you'd get 20 years mandatory minimum for possession of marijuana. Now, this drives a lot of people crazy and drove a lot of people crazy even back then. But that's how the law on the books worked. In 1973, President Nixon began the War on Drugs. The Drug Enforcement Agency was formed as the unified command for all drug enforcement in the United States. In 1973, there were about 1,500 agents in the DEA. They had a budget of about $75 million, with an M, $75 million, and they had 43 foreign offices. Today, they have a budget of over $2.3 billion with a B, dollars. They have over 5,200 agents. They have 87 foreign offices. The war on drugs has not gotten smaller over time, but has actually expanded. In 2004, just over one-half of federal prisoners were held for drug-related offenses. So how does this specific resolution deal with crime? Well, it's important to realize that a significant share of prisoners in our federal prisons are there because of drug crimes. Nearly 20% of prisoners say that they committed their crime just to get money to buy drugs. So this is a statistic from the Department of Justice which links individuals who use drugs with committing other crimes just to continue their habit. 4% of homicides, according to the Department of Justice, are related to drugs. This is drug-related in the sense of gang wars. This is drug-related in the sense of individuals who are on drugs at the time that they commit a homicide. More than 25% of criminals say that they committed their crimes while under the influence of a drug. This includes alcohol, so this statistic is not necessarily clearly just related to our resolution. In addition, there's a lot of crime from gang activity. We know that there are gangs out in the world that do use drugs as a way to support their trade, and this is an important reason that the Drug Enforcement Agency claims that they exist. In addition, there are international cartels and gangs which interact with the United States drug gangs to manipulate drugs throughout the United States market. These international gangs include gangs, which we might recognize, but also some terrorist networks which also use drugs as a way to fund their activities. These are arguments that are made for why we should continue to restrict drugs, because the thought is the use of drugs is something that is funding these sort of groups, which we don't think are good. One important thing to note is that every nation in the world has some role in international drug trade, whether that means growing the crops, whether that means distributing, whether that means using or selling. Pretty much every country in the entire world is in some way involved in the drug trade. And this might be something really interesting to look into as you research the topic. Now, not only are we supposed to look at the criminal justice aspect, but we're also supposed to look at the public health aspects of our drug laws. It's important to recognize that over 2/3 of inmates in the United States are themselves dependent on drugs or alcohol. It's important for us to think about how these implications could affect our society. If we in fact negate the resolution and we think that criminal justice is the proper step, then the public health argument might be we have the vast majority of individuals in our prison system who are themselves dependent on these drugs, and so maybe our criminal system isn't working as well as it ought to. One example of a public health approach which an individual might want to take in a debate round is the anti-smoking campaign, where we try to help people who are currently addicted to smoking quit. We try to prevent children from starting smoking. We try to regulate the advertising of cigarettes. And we regulate the distribution and sale. In the United States, you can't buy a cigarette if you're under the age of 18, and you're not allowed to sell cigarettes over state lines. These are regulations that are on the books in an attempt to try to limit the possession and use of cigarettes by underage individuals. In a sense, we're trying to protect people from being able to harm themselves by using cigarettes. Now, there's fair debate on both sides of the cigarette debate, but that might be one example that you could use in your case. Additionally, we have addiction counseling. This would potentially mean we don't have to incarcerate individuals. It might even be an alternative to criminal sanctions. Potentially it would mean the district attorneys, instead of threatening to send someone to jail, they would make someone an offer as a plea bargain and say, if you will accept drug counseling, maybe we won't have to go through with prosecuting you for these drug crimes. That's another potential option you could look into as you're researching. So what questions should we be asking as we look at this debate topic? We should say, does addiction even matter? Does the limitation to the resolution on the word addiction change the story? Should we care whether or not we're talking about drug use versus drug addiction? This is something your research is going to have to investigate. Second, is this an either-or proposition? Can the negative simply say that we need to have equal emphasis on drug control through public health and drug control through the criminal system? Or does the negative team have to support the criminal justice system? In addition, we should be thinking about what kinds of values this resolution provides us. What values might best uphold public health? And what values might best uphold criminal justice? Public health might ask us to think about societal well-being. Criminal justice might ask us to think about people following the law and having a good rule of law. These are values that are worth investigating. Some practical questions you should be asking yourself as we conclude. Can you eliminate trafficking and cartels if you treat drug addiction as public health? If so, how would that happen? And how would those organizations respond to the deregulation of drugs or to the treatment of drug addiction as public health? Does criminal law deter bad behavior? That's a really valuable question with a lot of literature out there. Worthwhile for you to research. How do we know if the war on drugs is a success or failure? Are there specific benchmarks or lines in the sand that we can point to and say, yes, the drug war is a success, or no, the drug war is a failure? Or are we unequivocal, and are we unsure whether that statement is true or not? Next, if we got rid of criminal sanctions, would more people be willing to try drugs? And potentially would those people then become addicted themselves? This would exacerbate the public health problem potentially, and so maybe that's a story that you would want to tell on the negative side. Is there a liberty interest in allowing an individual to harm him or herself? This might be a really interesting philosophical question that you want to start researching philosophers and say maybe an individual should have a fundamental liberty interest in the United States in harming him or herself. And finally, is the government obligated to protect its citizens from drugs? If we think that drugs are themselves harmful, is the government itself obligated? Does the government have a requirement in order to be a good government that it prevents its citizens from having access to these drugs? How could we make them less available? Could a government help the people who are harmed by drugs? Or what about, could the government help the people who are harmed by drug abusers? All of these questions are worthwhile questions you should be asking yourself as you dig in to this topic. I hope you have a lot of fun over the course of this semester, and the rest of this school year, this calendar year, debating this resolution. I think we're going to learn a lot about United States drug policy, and we're going to learn about how countries around the world are interacting with the drug trade. I hope you enjoyed this topic.